This is a talk with very little results because it's still ongoing. And I'll talk about, is this, okay, pardon? Oh, okay. Talk about a study on marijuana during pregnancy and the development of executive function and aggression in preschool age children.
Humans?
It's first done in animal model. The study is actually now we're seeing a lot of human.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Disclose no conflicts, and I acknowledge Peter Freed, who is working with us on this project and was the PI of one of the original cohorts to investigate this many, many years ago. I'll talk about the extent of the problem of marijuana use during pregnancy, what we know briefly on THC in the fetus, and summarize previous research. And I'll talk about what we're doing in our current study and some really very basic results about the pregnancy itself. And if you, most of us who have been following the news for the past decade realizes that there's been change in public attitudes toward marijuana use in general. And currently, as of the last election, 60% of the American population lives in states where marijuana, either medical or recreational, is legally available. And currently, according to polling conducted before the most recent election, about 2/3 of Americans support legal recreational marijuana use. The big change from previous versions of this talk is now Michigan has legalized recreational marijuana. And as you could see, many states, if not most, already allow medical marijuana. The next lightest color, and I can't, since I don't see colors very well, I'm not even sure what it is, but those are the states that allow cannabidiol, which really doesn't have much psychotropic effect. And then the lightest color states don't allow any marijuana. So this is something that has changed quite dramatically over the 2010s. When people have surveyed this at the national level, it should come as no surprise to find that young adults are the segment of our population that is most likely to use marijuana, and it should also be obvious that young adults are the segment of our population that is most likely to become pregnant. And so you could see that use is fairly common overall, and approximately 15% of 18 to 25-year-olds these days will admit to recent use. And even during pregnancy, we find that use is not at all rare, on the order of certainly between 5 and 10% of women who are pregnant will admit to use. Since at least the days that I was in college many years ago, marijuana has become much more potent. And this is from a lab in Mississippi where whenever the federal government makes a major seizure of marijuana, they have a contract with this lab, and they'll send a sample there for analysis of its THC content. And as you could see, current marijuana by weight is substantially more loaded with THC than it was 20 years ago, and certainly more than before then. So at a comparable level of use, the intensity of exposure to the active compound is increased substantially. I've just a couple of slides in this to keep the talk short, but this is an old letter to the editor from the New England Journal from now about 35 years ago, and this just compares women who came in labor intoxicated, and they were able to measure THC and its primary metabolite, which is carboxy-THC, in maternal and in cord blood. And as you can see, they found that cord concentrations are 15 to 40% of what we see in maternal blood, which should come as no surprise because THC is a quite lipophilic compound, and we would expect that it would not be much impeded by the placenta. The cannabinoid receptor was first identified in the early 1990s. The CB1 is the receptor that has psychotropic effects, and when people have evaluated its distribution in fetuses, we find that in the human fetus, receptor concentrations are quite high, and they're particularly concentrated in the hippocampus, which is the site of learning and memory, in the frontal lobes, which are higher cognitive functions, in the amygdala, of emotional response, motor function in the basal ganglia and cerebellum, as well as the reward center, the nucleus accumbens. And interestingly, when there have been cohorts to study marijuana, the long-term effects on children exposed in utero actually map to these areas of the brain. So from a scientific perspective, what people have found hangs together actually quite well. In spite of how common marijuana has been over the years, and certainly has become lately, there's not been a lot of previous research specifically focused on the impact of prenatal marijuana exposure on the developing fetus and child. Certainly in comparison to the large amount of research that was done during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1990s. There have been only two prospective studies that were specifically designed to evaluate marijuana use, and they're both 30 to 40 years old. One was done in Ottawa, which was, Peter Fried was the PI of that, and they focused largely on a middle-class population of pregnant women who were marijuana users. And then the second study was done by Nancy Day, a psychiatric epidemiologist at Pitt, who mostly studied a clinic population that is not all that different from the population we might see just down the street at Ohio State. In spite of studying very different populations, these two cohorts came up with remarkably similar results. To quickly trace you through what they found, they really did not see much in early childhood cognition. The standard IQ test for children under a couple of years of age is the Bailey score. Not all that great, but it is the standard. And they really didn't see any association with Bailey scores in Ottawa of marijuana use in pregnancy. In Pittsburgh, they saw something at 9 months with a decreased score, but it was not sustained at a later age. And so they've mostly wrote off the earlier one to just a random finding in response to our previous talk. But things started to declare themselves a little more in school years. In Pittsburgh, they used the Stanford Binet at age 3, and they showed short-term memory deficits in abstract reasoning and visual reasoning. In Ottawa, they showed fairly similar results with deficits in memory, with visual perceptual skills, as well as with verbal skills. The interesting point about this is that in neither case was the composite full-scale IQ impacted. And when they followed these children again at early school year, that is 5 to 6, they saw basically similar results. No impact of full-scale IQ, but impact of abstract reasoning, working memory, and visual perceptual skills. Both cohorts were seeing that. And then things became even clearer at age 10. Again, IQ was unaffected. And if you're kind of like most researchers who are not developmental psychologists, you'd say IQ is not affected and you'd probably quit there. Certainly that's what I might have done until I started looking at this literature. But what they found is these same abstract reasoning deficits and visual reasonings were persistent, and now they started to see both parent and teacher reports of inattention and impulsivity, which resulted in externalizing behavior, that is, acting out behavioral problems and delinquency. And this is when the investigators of these two cohorts recognized this as important components of executive function, and all this came together in their minds when the cannabinoid receptor was described and its location in the prefrontal cortex was mapped, and suddenly this all kind of hung together. I'm not a psychologist by training, and so I had to learn this. And what is executive function? We talk about it as function. It's really not a single entity, and it's not even a unitary entity. It's actually a collection of higher cognitive processes. And the way I think of it as a non-psychologist is not just how you test out in your IQ, it's actually the ability to put your IQ to something useful, to focus it and to work with it. It turns out that executive function, when people have tested this in children and then followed them over time, it actually correlates with success in school and even with your success in life better than your IQ. This is something that begins to develop, or at least it begins to be measurable in the preschool years. Probably the best we could do in an optimal setting now is start to measure early manifestations of this at 3 to 3.5. And the original cohorts didn't measure this because, one, they didn't expect to find it, and two, because they just didn't have the neuropsychological tests that enabled them to measure it. Many of these tests are computer-based, and we didn't have powerful PCs, we didn't have tablets, and so there really was not much ability to measure it. Executive function continues to develop through the mid-20s, and when I've gathered, although it's not my expertise, when people have started to look at older physicians and the senior physicians, they find that executive function, the ability to balance competing demands, the ability to step back, that sort of thing seems to be one of the things that actually begins to diminish in older physicians, and people are starting to think about how to deal with that. The best examples are things, if you've ever read the book by Kahneman, the behavioral economist, called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Thinking slow is executive function. The example I give is that I drive to work down Interstate 71 every day, and I get off at Main Street. My kid was taking a class on Saturday mornings at the Columbus College of Art and Design, and I had to remember to get off at Broad Street to get there. And probably one morning out of 3 on Saturday, when I was not 100% awake, I would drive right past the Broad Street exit and get off at Main Street. And that was a failure of executive function to say, hey, wait a minute, this is not a routine situation. You've got to take over and disconnect the autopilot and drive this car by hand. Another aspect of it is working memory, and that is the ability to keep something in mind for short term and recall it when you need it. The example I give is I fly light airplanes, which is you can have 10 thumbs and 2 left feet and do fine, but you need executive function. And lined up for the runway, and the tower wants to get an airplane out ahead of you, and so the tower will say, okay, you're cleared to land, but call me when you're 2 miles out. And so now you're coming into the airport, and you got to focus on flying the airplane and getting everything ready to land, and you got to remember in the back of your head to call that tower when you're 2 miles out. Fortunately, they've got binoculars, and if you don't, they'll call you on the radio and say, hey, where are you? The other one is cognitive flexibility. You're driving home, you hear on the radio there's a traffic jam ahead, and immediately are you thinking of, well, should I get off the road here? Should I take another route? Because the plan you had isn't going to work. And then the kids game that is a living test of executive function, as Simon says, it's your ability to control your impulse, to ignore distractions, and to focus on what you actually need to think about. So Simon Says is in many ways just an executive function test. And then finally another component is planning, and that would be you have a half a dozen errands to run on a Saturday morning, and you try to run through it in your head, and what's the best way to get through all of these errands to give you the afternoon off and do what you actually want to do. And these are components of executive function. With that as background, I'll talk a little bit about the Lifestyle and Early Achievement in Family Study. It really wasn't intended as a pun, but the acronym spells LIEF, so it kind of is a coincidence, although that wasn't our intent. We based this study, it's a historical cohort study based on the Ohio Perinatal Research Network's a repository to look at the effect or the association between marijuana use and pregnancy by the mother, and then the development of executive function and aggressive behavior, which has been reported in other studies in preschool and early school-aged children. We base this on the repository that Children's, in conjunction with the Department of OBGYN, set up in 2010. One aspect of this repository is we approached women during their prenatal care at the medical center. Most of the women were recruited at a high-risk clinic for women at risk of delivering premature babies, but we did some recruiting in the general clinic. Women who signed a consent had a questionnaire administered. We froze blood and urine, and we abstracted their charts. And when we set out to apply for funding, we thawed some of the urines and ran them for THC to get a sense of how many women were using during pregnancy, and I'll show you some of those results at the end. As you might imagine, it was not at all rare. Our repository had about 500 women whose children were age eligible, that is in the 3.5 to 7 year range. The consent included initial, if you don't mind being contacted in the future for as yet unspecified research. And about 80% of the women agreed to be contacted. There were 60 women who either miscarried or had a neonatal or child death, and so when we identified those women, we did not contact them. And that left about 340 women who were eligible for this study. We plan on being able to locate about 85% of those women. Columbus is, people move around a lot, but they don't leave the area that often. And we expected to be able to get 75% of those women to consent. So we will expect to have a total of about 250 children evaluated. And we've been at this now for maybe a year and a quarter, and those numbers seem to be actually pretty good. We set up 3 visit windows, that is 3.5, 5 and 7 years of age. Given the age of the children and the 3-year funding cycle of this grant, we think most of these children will be seen twice. Unfortunately, the grant isn't long enough to see children 3 times. And to date, we've mostly reached our 3-year goals and our 5-year goals, and children are just now aging into to our 7-year goals. And so we're on track to meet targets, which will give us about 80 to 85% power to detect the modest effect size, a moderate effect size of about 1/3 of a standard deviation in most of the measures, which is about what Fried and Day have found in previous years. We'll be evaluating them with standard psychological testing and physical growth measures. The repository collected a buccal swab, but often with short hospital stays, especially the term children got missed, and so we're going back and we'll collect DNA from the children we missed. The mothers will fill out standardized questionnaires both on their children and on themselves, and will be somewhat unique in that we will actually measure the maternal executive function and IQ, because as you might well imagine, the ability to have impulse control or the lack thereof is strongly correlated with drug use, and executive function does have a moderate heritability of H squares on the order of about 0.4 in most studies. And so maternal executive function can be an important confounder that we'll be measuring. The study visits will mostly employ the NIH toolbox, which was developed as part of the overall CCTS initiative. It's a standard battery of psychological testing that is appropriate for people over the entire age range. It's intended, although obviously the tests differ with the subject's age, but for the 3 to 85-year range, there's not a lot of pilot testing at 3. We find that at 3.5, it works in a sort of sometimes it does, and sometimes the children are just not able to do the tests, but by 5, we find it's pretty good. The components that we're using are executive function, and the tests in there focus mostly on cognitive flexibility and that Simon says ability to inhibit a response. We're looking at attention, episodic and working memory, language, and processing speed. We'll also assess in a lab setting aggression with the famous Bobo doll test, where there's like a punching bag doll that you've probably all seen over the years, and a research assistant puts it in the room and gives a little flick and then leaves the room for about 5 minutes, and we look to see if the child starts to beat up on the doll. We're doing some subscores from the Bailey, and we're looking at inhibition and switching, which is the ability to kind of classify things in multiple different ways. Tower of Hanoi is a standard planning test. It's kind of like the equivalent of you've got a boat and you've got 3 rocks to get across the river, and your boat can only hold so many pounds, and how do you get those things across the river in the smallest number of trips. We're looking at visuospatial and picture memory, and between the toolbox and these tests, we can estimate a full-scale IQ for both the child and for the mom. We'll be doing, as I mentioned, these same tests, or the age-appropriate versions, on the mom. We'll also be administering questionnaires to the mom on her breastfeeding history. There's standard questionnaires on childhood aggression, giving moms scenarios of your child is online to get a drink at the water fountain, and another child comes up and pushes them out of line. What would your child do? And we have 4 choices, and we give them the forced choice of each pair. Would they walk away? Would they say that's all right? Would they walk away versus yell at the child? Would they say that's all right versus push the child out back, and things? We're doing the child behavior checklist. We're doing a standard questionnaire for the mother reports on the executive functions of her child. We're measuring eating behavior, the home environment, the parenting style. That is the parent kind of like Ward Cleaver, or is the parent more like a drill sergeant, and various combinations in between. And then we're asking about peer relationships, and some of these questions at the 7-year exam will also be asking the child to report on him or herself. We'll also ask the mom standardized instruments on her behavior, on demographic information, on household composition, and we'll also ask mom to retrospectively report her drug use during the pregnancy and since then. Interestingly enough, there have been studies to show that women are more forthcoming about their drug use during the pregnancy when asked retrospectively than when asked at the time, which should, I suppose, come as no great surprise. And we'll also ask about violence in the home and about food insecurity and housing insecurity as well. At 5 and 7, we're sending out questionnaires to the teacher because most of the instruments we're using have a teacher report version of it. And so we'll be asking about behavior, about executive function and peer relationships, because school is a different setting than home, and children have different stimuli, and we'll see how that works across time. These are really very preliminary results from the pregnancy because we're not analyzing our new data until the study is nearly complete. But this is marijuana use among pregnant women at the prenatal clinics at OSU. Overall, almost exactly 1 in 3 women have evidence either by clinical recognition, self-report, or urine toxicology of marijuana use. Most of the positives, little over half, came from 2 sources, but as you might imagine, the single most common source, it would be the urine, and about 10% had only urine, but most women had multiple sources. And this is a sense, the last column is a sense of if you had to do one test, what does each one by itself pick up? The distribution of users should not, probably it was not overly surprising to us. It was more common in non-white women, and it was more common in women with less education, with the drop-off seeming to be college grad versus less than that. The rest of the associations were as you would expect, although they were not overly dramatic, at least when we looked at them, and to the degree that statistical significance matters, most of the other ones were not statistically significant except for race and education. But looking at them, you could see that marijuana use is fairly common across the spectrum of all these characteristics. The other thing that we found interesting is either by report or by urine toxicology, how common opiate use was in pregnancy, and that interestingly enough, it does not differ to any important degree by whether a woman was a marijuana user or not. And I've spoken to the people at the time, to the obstetrician who ran the clinic down the block for drug-abusing women, and asked what she thought about that. And she said, it wouldn't surprise me. Marijuana is just part of life in the community, and it's somewhat different from opiate use. Many of the drugs that we found on screen were available by prescription, and so we're still going through the charts to try to figure out how many of those reflect abuse versus how many reflect a woman who came in to the emergency room with a backache and an ER doc just gave her a prescription for Vicodin or something. The other difference is that cocaine was more common in our marijuana users, but was hardly overwhelming. And the big association, as you might well imagine, either between reported or reported plus toxicology, is that marijuana users were much, much more likely to smoke tobacco as well. The cotinine results are a little hard to interpret because our lab, the lab that ran these, used such a low cutoff for cotinine that some of it may well reflect passive exposure, and unfortunately we didn't spend the extra money to get them quantitated. But that's an analytic issue we'll have to resolve. So that's really what I have to report today. The summary is that marijuana is the most commonly used illicit substance in the US, and that young adults are the most likely to be users. Pregnancy is no exception. And that past research has indicated that in utero exposure is associated with an increased risk in executive function assessed at school age, but that pregnancy outcome, which I didn't present, and IQ generally remain intact. In other words, other studies in our study confirm this, but I deleted the slide for time, that we didn't see a substantial difference in low birth weight or premature delivery in marijuana users. And we're the first cohort study to look at this for quite a few years, and we will be evaluating the association between marijuana and executive function and aggression. And I'd like to acknowledge the team that's working on this, as well as our funding support from the March of Dimes and from NIDA, and that the repository where our urines was stored is, of course, part of the CCTS grant. And I'd like to acknowledge all them and thank you for your time. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. Thank you.